Episode 14: The Rise of Russia. Question 1. What was the significance of the Mongols in the early modern development of Russia? The Mongols played a crucial role in shaping the early modern development of Russia by profoundly influencing its political structure, economy, and territorial expansion. Following their conquest of Kievan Rus in the 13th century, the Mongols established the Golden Horde, which ruled the region indirectly for almost 2.5 centuries. While the Mongols did not seek to colonize or culturally assimilate the Russian lands, their system of tribute and vassalage centralized power in the hands of local princes who collaborated with them. The most significant beneficiary of this arrangement was Moscow, which emerged as the chief tax collector of the horde. Over time, this position enabled Moscow's princes to accumulate wealth, military strength, and administrative experience that would later underpin the rise of a unified Russian state. Mongol rule also shaped Russia's political culture. The autocratic style of government, reliance on military power, and emphasis on centralized control that characterized Muscovite Russia owed much to Mongol administrative practices. Additionally, the Mongols integrated Russian lands into a vast Eurasian trading network, exposing them to new goods, technologies, and diplomatic connections that linked them indirectly to China, Persia, and the Islamic world. When Moscow finally overthrew Mongol dominance in the late 15th century, it inherited not only political independence, but also the imperialist mindset and logistical systems of its former overlords. In this way, the Mongols, though foreign conquerors, laid the groundwork for the autocratic, expansionist, and Eurasian character of the early modern Russian state. Question 2. What role did militarization and expansion play in setting the pattern of Russian socioeconomic organization from the 15th century onward? Militarization and territorial expansion were central to shaping Russia's socio-economic structure from the 15th century onward. Emerging from centuries of Mongol domination, the rising Muscovite state defined itself through conquest and defense. Its vast, sparsely populated frontiers demanded a permanently mobilized society in which military service was both a duty and a means of social advancement. The Tsars organized this expansion through a service oriented nobility, granting land not as hereditary property, but as a conditional tenure tied to military obligation. This arrangement bound the aristocracy to the crown, creating a system in which wealth and status depended on continued loyalty and service rather than independent feudal privilege. Unlike Western Europe, where economic growth, urbanization, and commercial capitalism weakened feudal bonds, Russia's constant wars against the Tatars, Poles, Swedes, and later the Ottomans reinforced coercive labor systems. To maintain a standing army and frontier settlements, the state needed a stable tax base and a dependable supply of labor. This pressure led to the legal codification of serfdom in the 16th and 17th centuries, binding peasants to the land just as Western Europe was moving toward wage labor and market economies. Militarization thus sustained a feudal order long after it disappeared elsewhere. At the same time, expansion required administrative unity. The Tsar's ability to distribute land in exchange for service made the nobility dependent on the crown, leaving little room for autonomous aristocratic power. The result was a uniquely centralized and militarized social hierarchy, a system where the state dominated both the economy and the elite. In short, Russia's expansive militarism created a self reinforcing structure of autocracy, servile labor, and bureaucratic nobility, locking the country into a feudal model long after Western Europe had abandoned it. Question 3. Why did Peter the Great want to westernize? Peter the Great wanted to westernize Russia not out of admiration for Europe's culture per se, But because he saw Western Europe's technology, administration, and military organization as the keys to state power and survival, by the late 17th century, Peter recognized that Russia lagged far behind its European rivals in nearly every measure of modernization: shipbuilding, metallurgy, science, education, and commerce. His travels in the 1690s on the so called Grand Embassy through the Netherlands, England, and the German states confirmed what he already suspected. Europe's dominance rested on its technical innovation and disciplined institutions, not just its armies. Peter's goal, therefore, was pragmatic rather than aesthetic. He sought to cast Russia as a competitive great power, able to project force, manage an empire, and participate in global trade. To do that, he had to transform a feudal land based society into a centralized, service oriented state. Western models provided ready blueprints: bureaucratic hierarchies, naval engineering, scientific academies, and urban planning. His reforms, ranging from the creation of St. Petersburg as a quote unquote window to the West to the reorganization of the army and civil service, were meant to impose efficiency, discipline, and loyalty to the state. There was also a psychological and geopolitical dimension. Peter feared that unless Russia adopted Western methods, it would remain isolated and vulnerable, a semi Asiatic backwater surrounded by modern rivals. Westernization was thus a tool of security, prestige, and legitimacy, an attempt to pull Russia onto the stage of Europe's great powers, even if doing so meant breaking centuries of tradition. Question 4. How was Russia able to become a gunpowder state without engaging in widespread commercial activity or urbanization? Russia became a gunpowder state through state coercion and resource mobilization, not through the commercial and urban growth that fueled similar transformations in Western Europe and the Ottoman world. Beginning in the 15th century, the Muscovite state developed a highly centralized system in which the Tsar controlled land, labor, and taxation. Rather than relying on taxation of a middle class, the Russian state extracted revenue directly from its peasantry, whose labor was bound through serfdom. This stable, coercive base allowed the government to equip and maintain large standing armies without the market mechanisms that supported gunpowder warfare elsewhere. Military modernization under Ivan IV and later rulers was driven by necessity. Russia's vast frontiers and frequent wars with steppe nomads, Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, required artillery, fortifications, and musketeers. To sustain this, the Tsar established state armories and imported foreign experts, often through direct state initiative rather than private enterprise. Urban centers like Moscow or Tula became state workshops rather than commercial hubs. Thus, Russia's gunpowder revolution was a bureaucratic achievement, not a capitalist one. Russia's militarization reflected its autocratic structure, a centralized government commanding labor and resources through compulsion. Gunpowder strengthened that system, enabling the Tsar to expand and defend a vast empire while reinforcing the very feudal order that limited commercial and urban development. Question 5. Why did Peter the Great want cultural westernization? Peter the Great wanted cultural westernization because he understood that Russia's backwardness was not just technological or military, but civilizational, embedded in habits, values, and worldviews that he believed held the country back. During his quote unquote Grand Embassy tour of Europe in 1697 and 1698, Peter was astonished not only by Europe's shipyards and science, but also by its urban sophistication, literacy, and social polish. He saw culture, dress, manners, education, and science as inseparable from the discipline and rationality that made Western states powerful. To Peter, Westernization was thus a means of social engineering. By changing how Russians, and particularly Russian aristocrats, dressed, shaved, spoke, and even socialized, he hoped to reshape behavior and align his subjects with a modern, service oriented state. His decrees on shaving beards, adopting European clothing, and teaching geometry and navigation weren't acts of imitation, but of statecraft. He was trying to break the old Muscovite culture of isolation, ritual, and hierarchy, replacing it with one that valued practicality and order. Question 6. Why was Peter the Great's push for westernization not true modernization? Peter the Great's reforms were intended to make Russia stronger, not freer or more dynamic. He borrowed the technologies and institutions of Western Europe, naval science, administration, education, but not its social or intellectual foundations, such as individual rights, civic autonomy, or market freedom. His westernization was therefore instrumental rather than ideological. He wanted the tools of modernity without its values. True modernization in the historical sense involves structural change, the emergence of a more open economy, rule of law, and social mobility. Peter's reforms, by contrast, reinforced autocracy and serfdom. The state directed industry, dictated education, and defined culture from the top down. He created schools for engineers and officers, but not for citizens. Factories served the army, not private enterprise. Instead of weakening aristocratic hierarchy, he bureaucratized it through the table of ranks, making nobles state servants rather than independent actors. So while Peter westernized Russia's appearance and machinery, he did not modernize its foundations. Russia became more efficient, but not more liberal, more European in style, but not in spirit. His reforms produced a powerful empire, but not a modern society, an autocratic modernization, impressive, but incomplete. Question 7. What is a service aristocracy, and how might it explain a relative lack of innovation in the Russian state? The reforms of Peter the Great, followed by the reforms of Catherine the Great, gave new powers to the nobility over their serfs, maintaining a trade off that had been developing over the previous 2 centuries. As previously discussed, tax collection under the Mongols necessitated a centralized bureaucracy, antithetical to the classic feudalism practiced in medieval Europe. The Russian aristocracy thus occupied a much more subordinate position than their counterparts in Western Europe. But the expansionist policies that followed the Mongol era meant new fiefdoms awarded to Russian nobles had in essence been militarily occupied, so that the mutual obligation that in theory underpinned Western feudalism was missing from Russian feudalism. Russian serfs were conquered as such, and so were given the same disregard as shown by the Spanish towards Native Americans. In exchange for extraordinary authority over the serfs on their land, nobles were required to serve as part of a strong central government, staffing it as bureaucrats and officers. They were in this sense a service aristocracy, not an independent counterweight to the Tsar. Under the table of ranks system, the Russian elite held their wealth and status not by entrepreneurship, ownership, or independent initiative, but by state service. Their estates, ranks, and privileges were conditional on loyalty and performance in the bureaucracy or the military. This arrangement connected personal advancement to obedience and conformity, not to creativity or risk taking. Innovation, especially if it implied questioning established methods or hierarchies, could threaten a noble's position or invite suspicion from superiors. Nobles, therefore, had little incentive to invest in productivity or technology when their income was derived from serf labor guaranteed by the state, not from market competition. Unlike Western Europe's gentry or merchant classes, who profited by improving efficiency in trade, Russia's elites gained wealth through control of people, not production. This produced a culture of administrative competence without intellectual dynamism, a system designed to mobilize resources for war or expansion, but not to foster innovation, reform, or scientific advancement. In short, the service aristocracy made loyalty Russia's highest virtue and creativity its greatest risk. Question 8. Why was Poland a crucial factor in enmeshing Russia in Western European affairs? Poland, more accurately the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, was the key hinge between Russia and the rest of Europe, and it played a decisive role in drawing Russia into Western political, diplomatic, and military affairs. Poland's geographical position meant that it was fated to be an intermediary between Muscovy and Europe. Until the 18th century, Russia had no warm water port on the Baltic or Black Seas. Its only access to European markets was through Polish territory, which meant that whether in diplomacy, trade, or war, Russia could not interact with the West without confronting or cooperating with Poland. Poland was culturally and politically Western facing. Its ruling elite embraced Catholicism, Renaissance humanism, and parliamentary traditions. When Russia clashed with Poland, it was in effect colliding with the eastern border of Western Europe. These conflicts forced Russian rulers to engage diplomatically and militarily with the Western state system, building embassies, alliances, and a more sophisticated foreign policy. Finally, the partitions of Poland, 1772 to 1795, completed the process. Russia's absorption of vast Polish territories brought it into direct contact with Prussia and Austria, making it an integral part of European statesmanship. In short, Poland was both the bridge and the battleground through which Russia was pulled into the European orbit. One last note: that Russia was entering the European world is itself significant, but it was more important that Russia was much weaker than it thought. Russia was fundamentally behind Europe. In essence, Russia's 18th century success was built on militarized illusion, power without flexibility, reform without transformation, and victory without modernization. Its reach now exceeded its grasp. Question 9. In what ways was Russian serfdom closer to slavery than any Western European precursor? Russian serfdom was closer to slavery than any Western European precursor because it combined extreme legal restriction, total dependency, and hereditary bondage on a scale unseen in Europe after the Middle Ages. By the 17th century, Russian serfs were legally bound to both the land and their lords, with no recourse to the state. A series of mid 17th century reforms codified this system, forbidding peasants from leaving their estates and allowing landowners to buy, sell, or exchange the serfs with the land attached, effectively treating them as property. The nobles would eventually, of course, either use legal loopholes to circumvent the restriction or would ignore the law outright. In Western Europe, even at the height of medieval serfdom, peasants retained limited customary rights and could appeal to local or royal courts. Over time, economic growth and urbanization eroded the last of the feudal restrictions, transforming most peasants into free tenants or wage laborers. Russia, by contrast, moved in the opposite direction. As the state expanded and wars consumed ever more resources, it tightened control over the peasantry to ensure a stable tax and labor base. The key difference between Russian serfdom and slavery was ownership in practice, if not in law. While Western lords extracted labor through feudal obligation, Russian nobles extracted it through personal, state sanctioned domination. Serfdom in Russia became perpetual, hereditary, and transferable. Slavery in all but name, sustained not by local tradition but by state policy designed to uphold autocracy and military expansion. Question 10. Why was the Russian economy relatively underdeveloped at the time it entered the European political framework? When Russia began to participate fully in the European political framework, roughly from the 17th into the 18th centuries, its economy was relatively underdeveloped because of a combination of geography, historical legacy, and the priorities of its state building process. Geography played a major role. Much of Russia's territory lay far from warm water ports and major trade routes. Harsh climates, vast distances, and poor infrastructure limited the development of internal markets and made transportation costly and unreliable. Economic centers remained isolated, and commercial integration, so vital in Western Europe, was slow to emerge. Demography and social structure also stifled growth. A huge portion of the population were serfs, legally bound to the land and unable to move, invest, or consume freely. Labor was plentiful but unfree. Productivity was low because innovation offered little in the way of personal reward. The result was a stagnant, subsistence oriented economy in which landowners extracted wealth through coercion, not efficiency. On top of this, the state's priority produced a major commercial imbalance. From the 15th century onward, Russia's rulers focused on militarization and territorial expansion rather than commerce. The economy existed to support the military and the bureaucracy, not to generate private enterprise. When Peter the Great, quote unquote, modernized, he built factories to supply cannons and ships, not consumer goods. These were state industries, run by royal decree, not by competition. Finally, the Mongol legacy of centralized tribute collection left Russia with an extractive, top down fiscal system, but little commercial culture. There were few independent towns, guilds, or merchant classes comparable to Western Europe's. In short, Russia entered European politics as a militarily formidable but economically archaic power, strong in coercion, weak in productivity. Its wealth came from control of land and people, not from trade, credit, or innovation. The result was a shell state that projected a superficial authority, while also lacking the internal economy necessary to sustain that authority over time. Question 11. Describe the economic imbalance between Russia and Western Europe. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had undergone the commercial and early industrial revolutions, developing dynamic market economies based on urbanization, private enterprise, technological innovation, and international trade. In contrast, Russia's economy remained largely agrarian, autocratic, and coerced, with wealth concentrated in land ownership and the state, rather than in a productive middle class. Western Europe relied increasingly on free or semi free wage work that rewarded productivity and specialization. Russia's economy was dominated by serfdom, which locked most of the population in subsistence agriculture. Productivity per worker and technological innovation was minimal. Western Europe's dense network of towns fostered commerce, banking, and manufacturing. Russia had few genuine market towns, and most quote unquote cities were administrative centers dependent on state service, not trade. Western economies accumulated capital through colonial trade, maritime enterprise, and banking systems. Russia lacked comparable access to global commerce and credit markets. The state borrowed heavily from abroad, but offered few opportunities for domestic investment. Western Europe developed networks of roads, canals, and ports that knit regional markets together. Russia's vast distances, unforgiving climate, and weak transport network isolated its interior. Western monarchies increasingly partnered with merchants and financiers. Russia's autocracy prioritized military expansion and control over economic freedom. Ultimately, Russia's economy was extractive, relying on coerced labor and territorial exploitation, while Western Europe's was self sustaining and productive, driven by trade, innovation, and capital accumulation. The imbalance left Russia perpetually powerful in armies, but poor in markets, a deadly combination that would embroil Russia in conflicts that they lacked the resources to win in the long term.